Welcome to the Chase Podcast. Dr. Ron Charles is a renowned archaeologist, author, historian, speaker, missionary, and is known as the Christian Indiana Jones. Dr. Charles has spent over 50 years researching and uncovering truths about Jesus Christ and information that proves the historical authenticity of the Bible. Gleaned from his years of tireless research, ministry, and archaeological work as the pages of the Bible come to life like never before. Visit cubitfoundation.org for Dr. Ron's books and information about this global ministry.
Hello, I'm Dr. Ron Charles. Thanks for tuning in to the program today. We're talking about Jesus and what has been classified as the Sermon on the Mount. It actually wasn't a sermon to the multitudes, as you see on 20th Century Fox or Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. This teaching, called the Sermon on the Mount, was given to Jesus' 6 disciples at the time. You had Philip, you had the Nathaniel, Bartholomew, you had Peter and Andrew and James and John. And so you had these 6 first called disciples. Now, these disciples had certainly been under the influence of the teachings of the Pharisees and religious leaders up to this point, but now they were going to join Jesus. They were going to go with him as he went out to do his ministry, as he healed the sick, as he taught, as he showed the world a brand new method, is that love is what is more important than anything else. Love and acceptance, forgiveness, something that the Jews were not familiar with. They hadn't forgiven anybody since the time of the kings, and so now Jesus was saying something that hadn't been preached in centuries to the Jewish people. But Jesus said, "This is how it must be. This is how I live. This is how I teach. And if you're going to be my disciple, then you too must adopt it." And we see this very first teaching to these first disciples on this sermon that we call the Sermon on the Mount. It was a teaching to them. Now, initially, Jesus told them what he expected from them. This is my philosophy. This is my way of looking at things, my way of life. And now, not only do I want you as my disciples to adopt this, I want you to believe in it. I want you to accept it into your life as your way of life also, not because I'm demanding it of you, but because you know that it's the right thing to do. And so he taught them initially with what Jesus felt. He said, "Blessed are the mournful. Blessed are those who seek after righteousness. Blessed are the peacemakers." All of these things were totally contrary to what they had been taught by the Pharisees and by the religious leaders of the Jews. Jesus was opening a brand new book to them, a brand new book that was opened that they'd never heard of, never seen, never even thought about. But here Jesus was living it, and they were going to do their best to do the same thing. Now, after Jesus introduced them to his own philosophy, then he began to talk to them. And he says, "To my Father, you are the most precious thing there is." And he used the analogy of salt. Now, the salt analogy was quite effective, because at that time, salt was actually more valuable than gold or silver. The Roman military would go into countries, many of these countries, for the purpose of seizing salt mines or exposed salt flats. As a matter of fact, when Julius Caesar invaded what is now the country of Austria, he did so for the primary purpose of seizing the salt mines of Hallstatt, Austria. And because salt by them had become an indispensable commodity. Now, salt really came into its own under Alexander the Great. Alexander found out pretty quickly that if he fed his soldiers meat before the night before a major battle or the day before a major battle, that his soldiers would have more strength and they would have more ability, they would have more stamina on the field. And so on the day before or the night before an impending battle for the next day, then he fed his soldiers meat. Now, this was fine. The supply lines were fine as long as he was in Macedonia, as long as he was in Greece. But when his army crossed the Bosphorus and went into Persia, into present-day Turkey, then it became more difficult because the supply lines became so long that meat just wouldn't keep. The soldiers wouldn't be able to eat it. Now, one of the generals of Alexander was out hunting, and he killed some rabbits, and it started to rain on him. So he ran inside of a cave that was near there, and while he was there waiting for the rain to stop, he skinned the rabbits, and he was just going to skin them and then take them with him back to his camp. And so as he was skinning these rabbits, then the messenger came and called him by name and says, Alexander is looking for you. You must come now. And so he didn't hesitate. He took these half-skinned rabbits and threw them over the corner of the cave and took off and kind of forgot about them. But what had happened is that when he threw those rabbits that were half-skinned over into the corner, they landed on top of an exposed salt vein that was in that cave. Now, he was back hunting about 2 or 3 weeks after that, and it started raining again. He went sought shelter in the same cave, and he noticed that the meat of these rabbits had not spoiled. They seemed to have been drained of their blood, but they weren't rotted, they weren't spoiled, they weren't decayed in any way. And that's how it was first discovered by mankind that salt was a preserver. It pulls the blood out of meat and preserves that meat for extended periods of time. Well, Alexander began to do that, and he marched all the way to India and laid siege to India, and then came on back to Babylon. That entire route, every day before a major battle, he would serve his army meat, and that meat that had been preserved by salt was a great asset to this battle plan that Alexander developed. Well, by the time the Romans came on the scene 300 years afterwards, then salt was no longer something that was a privileged class. It was no longer something that only the rich would have. Kind of like today, 100 years ago, an icebox was pretty standard in homes. A refrigerator was not even heard of. By the World War II, refrigerators began to take the place of ice boxes, and but even then, it was considered a luxury. Ice boxes was still the main way of preserving the food. The refrigerators were fantastic, but they were kind of for the privileged and those who could afford it. But nowadays, a refrigerator is mandatory. Even the most poverty-stricken of people would still have a refrigerator in today's America. This was a case with salt. By the time the Romans came on the scene, salt was no longer a luxury. It was no longer something that was only used by the rich and was kept by the rich. It was now everyday use, and it was mandatory for daily involvement with families all over the Roman Empire. And so salt was in great demand. And in many instances, salt actually had more value than gold or silver. So Jesus is telling his disciples, you are more precious than gold and silver in the eyes of God. You are salt. You are the most precious commodity in the world, and certainly the most precious to me. But at that time, the largest exposed source of salt in the world was the salt flats of the Dead Sea in Judea. Presently, the Dead Sea still is the most salty body of water in the world. And so what the Romans did, what Augustus Caesar agreed to, and what Tiberius Caesar continued to agree to, is that if the Jewish people, the Judeans, would gather up salt and ship that salt to Rome, then they could pay 1/2 of their tax liability to Rome in salt. It was a good deal for the Judeans because it was free salt. All they had to do was load it up and ship it off. And then Rome would cut their tax liability in half, which they did do. And so the Judeans were quite active in harvesting this salt and sending it to Rome. And what Rome would do is they would wait until they had a number of ships that were in dock in Haifa or in Joppa, Caesarea Maritima, and they would wait until they had maybe 8 or 10 or 12 ships to ship in a caravan to Rome. And so what would happen is that the Judeans would load the ship up with salt. They would cover it to protect it from rain and such, and then they would then go to the next ship and do the same thing. Well, these zealots that were in the Galilee who hated the Romans and wanted to do everything that they could to sabotage anything that was Roman would sneak under the cover of night, and they would go underneath these covers where the salt was located on the ships while the ships were parked in the harbor, and they would mix dirt in with the salt. Well, the Romans didn't know what had happened, and so on the way to Rome, these caravans, then the salt would begin to have a chemical reaction with the dirt, and this is what is called the salt losing its savor. By the time the ships got to Rome, then the salt had too much dirt to be any good for salt, and the dirt had too much salt to be any good for dirt. And so what Jesus is telling his disciples is this. He says, you can't compromise. You can't bring the world into your preciousness. You can't play with the world and expect to be accepted by God as one of his elite and one of his greatest and one of his chosen. And you can't allow this to happen, because if you do, you're going to have too much of the world to be any good for God and too much of God to be any good for the world. Now, at that time, Rome was building roads all over the world. And they discovered that if you lay a layer of this dirt salt down in the roadbed, that grass that would normally grow up into the road would be stopped. And the grass would not grow up into the road and would not weaken the road and cause the road to crack and develop holes in it. And so what Augustus Caesar began to do is he began to initially, they would just dump this salt dirt mixture over into the sea. But as he discovered a good use for this, he would put a layer of this salt dirt mixture in the roadbed, and it actually would stop the grass from growing up into the road. And now these roads not only would last for months, but last for years. As a matter of fact, I've even traveled on Roman roads myself that were built 2,000 years ago and are still being used today. And the reason why they're still being used, because the elements have not destroyed it because of this layer of salt dirt mixture. And so actually, Jesus was absolutely right when he says that salt has lost its savor. It's good for nothing and to be thrown out and to be trodden underfoot of men. And that's exactly what it is. Trodden underfoot of men as a roadbed on roads that men travel on. And so Jesus is telling these disciples, guys, you know how I feel. You know my heart. You know the things that I live by, the principles that I adopt, and not only adopt, but live by. But now you need to know something. Because you are my disciple, because I have chosen you, you are indeed the apple of God's eye. You are more precious to him than gold and silver. You are the most precious thing there is on the earth. But if you compromise that preciousness with the world, if you compromise your beliefs, you compromise your ministry, if you compromise your position and bring the world into it, then you're going to lose your preciousness. You'll have too much of the world to be any good for God, and you'll have too much of God to be any good for the world. You'll be worthless, and nothing would be good for you other to be run over by everybody. And so just don't do it. Keep yourself pure. Do not compromise. And then there was Herod the Great would build warning cities all over the Judea and the Galilee area. These warning cities would warn of enemy approaching. Now, these cities were set on a high hill in a region, the highest hill in a region, and it was four corners or four sides, a perfect square. And anyone in the valleys or in the general area, they could look up to that city, and they could know if enemy was approaching. And what would happen? They would have a flare, a fire flare at night, but then flags in the daytime. And so, if there was a yellow flag on the north wall of this city, when people looked up and saw that, they say, all is clear, no problem. But if there was a red flag up on that north wall, it meant enemy had been sighted. You need to make your way to the security of the warning city now. Begin to make your way there for your safety. Now, if there was a red flag on the north wall and the east wall, it meant that the enemy was heading towards the warning city and it was going to be under attack. Come into the safety now. Now, if there was a red flag on the west, the east, and the north, it meant they were under attack. And so if you were going to get there, you got to get there now. But they were now under attack. And then when there was a red flag on all four walls, it meant they were under siege. Gates were closed. You can no longer come into the safety of the city. Find safety someplace else. And then when a black flag was raised on the north wall and the other red flags came down, it meant the city had fallen. And so the warning city had a specific purpose. They also had privileges. If you lived in that city, and if you wanted to live in that city, you were tax-free. You didn't have to pay taxes to Rome or to anybody. You also received stipends from the Roman government as payment. You were a Roman citizen, and that citizenship passed down to your children, even your grandchildren. And so you had those great privileges, but the privileges came with responsibility. And the responsibility was to warn of danger, and then those that came and sought security in you or in that city, you had to take care of them and to protect them. Jesus is telling his disciples, says, you guys are that warning city set on a hill. You're responsible to warn people of the dangers of evil. You're not only do you warn them, but when they come to you to ask questions, to seek help, to seek security, you have to be there and give it to them. You have to give them counsel. You have to give them food. You have to give them companionship. You have to help those people. And so Jesus said to these disciples, he said, it's not enough that you know where I'm coming from and you adopting the same thing. It's not enough that you're the most precious thing in God's sight and you can't compromise. But you also can't hide. You are my disciple. And as my disciple, people are going to know that you believe the same thing I believe. And so you can't hide. If you are going to reap the privileges of discipleship, then you also must know the responsibilities. And you must be willing to accept those responsibilities. When people come to you for help, help them. When they come to you for a shoulder to cry on, let them. When they come to you for comfort, comfort them. When they come to you for counsel, then do your best to be that godly guidance in their life, because you are indeed a city that's set on a hill. If you don't want the responsibility, fine, don't accept the responsibility. But if you are my disciple, then you must accept your responsibility and do what you must do. And the same goes with us today. We are Jesus's 21st century disciples today. And all of you, just like them, who claim that you are a disciple of Jesus, then you are. You are his disciple. You believe what he believes, and you are out there doing his work, then you are his disciple. As such, then this teaching goes for you also. You are that city that's set on a hill. You can't hide. And because you can't hide, you must be open to give comfort, give help, and give support. The enemy doesn't choose the time that he attacks. He just attacks, which means that you as a disciple, you have to be on call 24 hours a day to help these people and to be that warning city as Jesus suggested to these disciples and is now suggesting to you. And you can do it, or else he wouldn't have told you that you could do it. He wouldn't have chose you to be his disciple if he didn't think that you could carry out the responsibilities. Yes, you are precious in God's sight. Yes, you are more costly than gold and silver. But you also have a distinct responsibility. You've been given privileges. You've been given eternal life. You've been given his name to use as a name of authority. You have been considered now a child of God. But as such, you also have the responsibilities to helping those who come to you for help. May the Lord bless you today.
Hi, I'm Dr. Ron Charles of the Cubit Foundation. You know, we've been in Middle East for going on 30 years. And I would love to come to your church or your meeting to let you know what's happening in reality in the Middle East. And we'd love to come there and let you know what's happening, what the Lord's doing in that part of the world. So if you can contact us at thecubitfoundation.org, then we could come to your place. And if you would like to find out more about us, then go to www.cubitfoundation.org. Thank you.
The Chase with Dr. Ron Charles is sponsored by supporters of the Cubit Foundation. Visit cubitfoundation.org for Dr. Ron's books and discover how you can support this global ministry.